Okay, for those of you who are self-isolating, here is the lesson on the case study of brain damage, which is linked to further evidence for there being two separate stores of memory. So this is our second study which supports the multi-store model of memory. I think you may have seen this documentary on Clive Waring, but you can always stop the presentation here and watch it again. So remember, Clive Waring is not not the subject of our case study, but it's a good example of a very similar incident in which someone's hippocampus was damaged, leading to catastrophic memory loss. So if you want to watch that again, do pause the video here. Okay, so your task, find out what is the hippocampus, where is it located, and what is its function. So if you want to pause the presentation here and just complete those tasks. Okay, so what you should have found is that the hippocampus is a small curved formation in the brain that plays an important role in the limbic system. Now, the limbic system is connected to the regulation of and production of emotion. So it's interesting that something that is implicated with memory is part of an emotional brain system. The hippocampus is involved in the formation of new memories and is also associated with learning and emotions. So it's interesting that the hippocampus we can see as being linked to short-term memory. Obviously, if you are producing new memories all the time, you're using your short-term memory. It's thought that the long-term memory is located in different parts of the brain, that it's much more widespread across the cortex, whereas the hippocampus, which is a very small structure in the brain, is thought to be linked to short-term memory and the formation of new memories. And that's, you can see where it is in the brain. Hippocampus is Greek for seahorse, so it's the implication is that the hippocampus looks a little bit like a seahorse. Right, so the case that we're going to be looking at is the most famous case in psychological and medical records, which is the case of HM, not H&M, right? H&M is a shop, right? Okay. So what you need to do is to find this now. I will put it on the team section that has the recorded lessons. So if you can look under the recorded lessons for your year group, you will find a summary of the study on there. So that's for you to look through. Now, when you're reading through the study, don't be put off by some of the kind of more biological, technical terminology on there. All you need to be focused on really is the damage that was done to HM's hippocampus. Don't worry about some of the more technical words. It's not necessarily necessary to really use them. So we're going to evaluate this research. So I suggest that you pause the presentation here and you go across to the study on Teams, read through the study and have it handy with you so that you can use it to address these issues of validity. So remember, this is evaluation. We're not just commenting on the study. We're not just describing it. We're looking at how we view it in terms of its strengths and its limitations. And in this case, validity. Validity means how real is this in terms of a piece of research, in terms of how real it is for the participant, in terms of the realness of what is being investigated. Is it real behaviour or is it artificial behaviour under lab conditions? So this is something that's very important for us to consider. You have to ask yourself the following. Now, obviously, we can't do this because you're not in class. So what I would like you to do is I will bring up the points for you to look at, and you can apply them to the case study. So what I would suggest you do is have the study summary to hand and work through each of these points. See if you can work through them on your own. Pause the presentation and then I will talk you through each point. So just see how you do. So here's the first point. Does this research actually measure what it sets out to measure? In other words, is it investigating the impact of brain damage on memory? And if so, how do we know? Is this research in-depth and detailed? In other words, it's not a snapshot lab experiment. If you think about the Glanzer and Kunitz serial position effect research, that was a lab experiment. That was a one-off, one participant, one score at one time. Then those participants went off and carried on with their lives. With HM, there's the case study of HM. HM is constantly studied. He's being constantly studied by a range of doctors and researchers. So it's a completely different approach to research. Has the research been carried out in real settings involving real and uncontrived behaviour? Uncontrived simply means not in lab conditions. It's this behaviour that the researcher is viewing, observing, recording, measuring in a real kind of context. Yeah, so that's quite an interesting one. So have a think about that one. Can we trust the ways in which the data has been gathered, or is there anything to suggest that the data might be overly biased or false in any way? So at this stage, I suggest that you pause the presentation here and have a go at these points, these evaluation points. Now clearly they're not necessarily very easy, but that's the whole point, is to challenge yourself and to push yourself into looking at evaluation in depth, because that is what's going to get you the marks in the exam. Right, okay, so I'm assuming that you've taken some time, you've looked at the study, and you have taken some notes, made some notes based on these questions. So, because I can't actually ask you in person, I'm going to go through the sort of things that you might be looking for. And remember, with evaluation, you don't have to come up with definite answers. You can make suggestions, you can ask questions, you can pose a thought or an issue. You don't have to say it's this or it's that, because sometimes we don't know, because we're dealing with human beings and it's not always 100% clear where that behaviour has come from or what we can conclude. So this is why psychology is an imprecise science, really. It's what they call a soft science. It's not like physics or chemistry or biology where you can say X equals Y. So don't be afraid in your evaluation to just make suggestions, or to say, well, possibly it could be this, or maybe it could be that. That's actually high level thinking. It's if you just say, oh, it's this, it's that, that's not as interesting an evaluation. That wouldn't get you as high marks as making suggestions. So the first question, does this research actually measure what it sets out to measure? Well, it did. Yeah, I mean, clearly this is one that you can be quite confident on to some extent, because the original research was done by the doctor who performed the operation on HM's brain, and then detailed lots and lots of notes about HM from observations, from interviews, from psychometric tests of IQ, personality, memory, conversations. And then later on, we had Milner come in and conduct MRI scans on HM's brain, where they could actually see what had happened to his hippocampus. So we have a mass of research here. So I think we can be pretty sure that it's high in validity, because it's not a one-off. They didn't measure him on one day and then he went away, and then they based a whole kind of theory of what happens in the brain in terms of memory on that. This was decades of research. So I think you can be pretty clear about that. Now, but you have to be careful. If you want to produce a really good evaluation, you can then say, there's a suggestion that the brain damage, the loss of the hippocampus, the 50% of his hippocampus, is linked to his memory impairment. But there may be other factors. He had epilepsy, which was caused by the accident that he had when he was 9 years old. So there could be something else that also accounts for the memory loss. But there's pretty compelling evidence that it is the hippocampus damage which can be linked to his memory loss. Be really careful in psychology never to say, this is what happened. This is what could have happened. There's a link, there's a kind of biological correlate there. But you can't say this was the cause, this made it happen, this is proof. We never use the word proof or proves. It doesn't work with human behaviour because we never really know what's behind it. So don't use proof, proves, don't say it caused it, it made it happen. All we can say is there appears to be a link. Yeah? So you have to be careful what you say in your evaluation. Is this research in-depth and detailed? Well, yes, it is. I mean, they had mountains of research on HM. It wasn't a one-off experiment. It's not an experiment. It's a case study. A case study is a collection of different research methods, some of which result in quantitative data, like the questionnaires or the psychometric tests or the MRI scans, and others, there's a lot of qualitative data, interviews, observations, conversations that they had with him on a day-to-day basis, looking at his behaviour. So it's very in-depth and detailed. There's an awful lot of research there. There's a lot of data. The participants in Glanzer and Kunitz gave one response. They had one score each, that's it. We don't know anything about those participants. We know loads about HM. So it's the opposite to a snapshot lab experiment. Has the research been carried out in real settings involving real and uncontrived behaviour? Now this is one where you can really show that you're good at evaluation. Because how real is life for HM? HM suffered this catastrophic brain injury caused because of the medical intervention. At the time, they didn't realise that memory was located in the hippocampus, short-term memory. They thought the brain was just like one big blob that carried out all functions all over the place. Now we know that the brain is not like that. But in the 1950s, they didn't know that. So, how real is life for HM after this brain injury? Well, he can't form new memories. He has some long-term memory. His long-term memory was damaged, but not as much as his short-term memory. He could not form any new memories at all. He could remember something for maybe about 15 minutes, but then he'd forget it. So it's not as bad as Clive Waring, whose short-term memory was pretty much non-existent. But he could tell him something, and for the next 15 minutes, yeah, he would know what you'd said, and then half an hour later, he's forgotten the conversation. He's forgotten who you are. He doesn't know who you are. Every morning he would wake up and not know who his doctors were, who'd been working with him for years. So, there is massive short-term memory loss here. He couldn't process the memory and get it into his long-term memory. It just kind of sat in his short-term memory for a bit and then it was pushed out, it was displaced. So there is some real damage here. So how real is that for HM? This is what I would say, that it's much more real than a lab experiment because he's living his life and he's dealing with this memory loss. But in terms of high ecological validity, well, he spent the last years of his life and quite a long part of his life in a nursing home. He wasn't at home. He couldn't live a real life. His real life had been lived prior to this brain damage that he incurred at the age of 27 when he had the operation. So is his behaviour real? Is he reacting because he's been in a nursing home, a medical setting for so long? Has he changed because of that? Has he become institutionalised? So this is a real question to ask. You could say, yes, it's high in ecological validity because they are simply recording the behaviour of someone who's just going about their daily business. But at the same time, it is a very unreal situation for everybody involved, really. This is such a unique case. You can't generalise the findings of this to anybody. So you could say, well, how real is this for him? Can we trust the ways in which the data has been gathered, or is there anything to suggest that the data might be overly biased or false in any way? Well, I don't think the data's false because the doctors wouldn't be able to publish false data, and there were too many of them involved. Why would they make it up, and why would HM pretend to have this awful memory loss that means basically he can't function or live a normal life? So it's not false, but maybe there could be some bias. If you're working with the same participant for years, you may start to feel differently about them as you do your other patients. You may lose objectivity, neutrality. You may start to like them too much. You might start to dislike them. You might not report some findings that don't really fit in with your version of how things should be. So it could be that when you have a close relationship between researcher and patient, that the researcher may begin to be overly biased and lose some of their objectivity. We don't know that that's what's happened. Don't say this is what happened because we don't know. But you can suggest it. Suggestion is a really good way of evaluating. Okay, so this is the final task here. How does the case of HM support the multi-store model? In other words, that there are separate memory stores. Okay, so pause the presentation here. Give yourself a few minutes to just write 1 or 2 sentences to respond to this question. Okay, so you might have written something like, the case of HM can be used to support the multi-store model because after HM's hippocampus was almost totally destroyed, he could not form new memories. Therefore, he had no real short-term memory, although his long-term memory was to some extent intact. Therefore, memory may be located at different parts of the brain and stored in different parts of the brain. So that is how this study supports a multi-store model of memory. As long as you've said something along the lines of, after the damage to his hippocampus, he had trouble with short-term memory. He couldn't make new memories, but he did still have some long-term memory. Therefore, the brain must store memory differently, different memory stores. And that's it for this topic.